need use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization, a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if we can't gather together in person. I'd like to thank Perri and Paula for appearing tonight to help make this possible. Town Hall will continue to produce virtual content this fall, including our podcast, In the Moment, which features exclusive guests, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Jane Fonda and Elizabeth Lesser talking about the superpower of women, Howard Gardner about the benefits and necessity of a synthesizing mind, Katsura Sunshine presenting on Reikugo storytelling, and more. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to event cancellations and the ever-changing landscape. We hope you'll consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation or becoming a member. Click on the donate button at the bottom of your screen, or you can make a donation online or text Town Hall to 44321 to give. Our partner booksellers have been hit by the negative effects of the COVID outbreak as well, and could use your support. We encourage you to support independent bookstores by purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight. Use the link on this live stream page to purchase through Third Place Books. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page, linked here in the chat. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for rewatching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about 60 minutes, including Q&A. Perri and Paula will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. You can also vote on which questions will be addressed by clicking the arrow next to the question to upvote it. We cannot guarantee we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arnold Matulski Science Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, Wyncote Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Perri Klass is a professor of journalism and pediatrics at New York University, co-director of NYU Florence, and national medical director for Reach Out and Read. She writes the weekly column, The Checkup, for the New York Times. She has written extensively about medicine, children, literacy, and knitting. Her medical journalism has appeared in a wide variety of publications, including The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The New Yorker, The New England Journal of Medicine, and Harvard Medicine. She began writing about medicine and medical training when she was a medical student, and her accounts are collected in 2 books, A Not Entirely Benign Procedure, 4 Years as a Medical Student, published in 1987, and Baby Doctor, A Pediatrician's Training, published in 1992. Her most recent book of medical journalism was published in 2007 and is entitled Treatment, Kind and Fair, Letters to a Young Doctor. She has also written nonfiction books about mother-daughter relationships, co-authored with her mother, and parenting co-authored by Dr. Eileen Costello. Paula S. Fass is a professor of history emerita at UC Berkeley and the author of several books, most recently The End of American Childhood, A History of Parenting from Life on the Frontier to the Managed Child, which presented an imperative history of parents and children in American history over the course of 200 years. Over her 45-year career, she has researched and written about many areas of American culture and society, including parenting, immigration, education, sexuality, and youth culture. Klass's book, A Good Time to Be Born, How Science and Public Health Gave Children a Future, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Perri Klass and Paula Fass.
Well, it's a great pleasure to join Dr. Perri Klass this evening for a conversation which I hope will move in all kinds of directions. But we will begin with this wonderful book that she's written that is both very rich in terms of pediatric information, but extraordinary, I think, for someone who's not trained in history, for its grasp of all the historical dimensions of issues of childhood in medicine and public health. So I'm going to start, Perri, by asking you, about this extraordinary title, which really is it's from the child's point of view, that this is a good time to be born. As we all know, some parents might not consider it a great time to be a parent. So let's begin with why it's a good time to be born for a child.
It's a good time to be born because if you're born these days and in recent decades, you can expect to live to grow up, and your parents can expect you to live to grow up. So it's a good time to be born for a child, but it's also, and I know I'm saying this at a stressful moment for many parents. I know I'm saying it at a time when we're worried about our world and we're worried about our children and we're worried about our future. But what I was writing about in this book, what I was looking back to, and I know I'm talking to someone who really is a historian and has an appreciation of the worlds that are lost as history rolls forward. What I was writing about was that idea of a lost world in which parents understood that many, many children did not live to grow up, and in which that was just part of the package of being a parent. And here we are now, as we came to the end of the 20th century and into the 21st, in a world in which, as parents, we not only hope, but we've come to be able to believe and expect that almost all children will, in fact, live to grow up. We no longer live in a world where we have to accept as an inevitable, tragic, but also somewhat routine consequence of our lives that we're going to lose children.
Well, I think it's important that most people don't recognize the degree to which, over the course of nearly 100 years, it's really not much more than that, maybe a little bit more, that transformation has taken place where parents expected to lose children, if not immediately at birth, then certainly by the time they were 6, to a time where losing a child is the most devastating and horrifying experience that anybody could imagine. And it can't be imagined because it's so infrequent at this point. Now, obviously, there are still parents who lose children, and it's always a terrible, terrible loss and a terrible experience. But that dramatic transformation is heavily a result of what has happened in terms of research, in terms of public health, in terms of new controls by the government, new interventions that has made childhood a much safer experience. Tell us about a few of those changes. I know one of your favorites is to discuss something that we no longer imagine as a threat, and that's diphtheria.
Well, so absolutely. I mean, I'm a pediatrician. I trained in pediatrics in, Children's Hospital in Boston in the 1980s, which probably seems like a long time ago to some people, but to me seems not that far ago, not that long ago. But by the 1980s, when I was training in pediatrics in Boston, essentially no child was supposed to die. We didn't go into the emergency room in the evening thinking, well, some children are going to come in with diphtheria. And of course, there are the children who come in with another long list. Sometimes there were tragedies, sometimes there were accidents, sometimes there were terrible stories. But for the most part, if you're my age or a little older or any younger, one of the reasons you go to pediatrics is because we can aim to see all of our patients outgrow us. They should all grow up to stop going to the pediatrician and start going to the adult doctor. We can actually aim for something close to 100%. I mean, let's face it, if you practice medicine, you don't get up in the morning and say, none of my patients should ever die. That's not the approach you take, but it kind of is the approach you take in pediatrics. It was kind of the joy. There were a lot of things that still seemed very close to being miracles and a lot of great outcomes because the vast majority of our patients do outgrow us and graduate from us. But, so you mentioned diphtheria. Well, I went through my training in that Boston hospital in the 1980s. I never saw a child with diphtheria, not one. It was something that I learned out of textbooks. But what a monster that was. What a sort of specter, what a threat. This very infectious bacterial disease, which was a relatively common disease of childhood, which appeared in epidemics. It's a respiratory disease. It attacks the airway. And one of the things I try to talk about in the book is there are some vulnerabilities that are built into being a child. Airway vulnerabilities, because the airway is so much smaller in a child. So anything which inflames the airway or obstructs the airway is much more damaging in a child. So you look at diphtheria and you look at the beginning of the 20th century when my grandmothers and grandfathers were alive, and you're looking at a disease which is terrifying, which is catching, which is particularly dangerous in young children. And it's one of the first great triumphs of bacteriology, because in the last half of the 19th century, people are figuring out the causation of diseases, right? You know, pasteurizing milk, figuring out the way these infections are transmitted. And one of the first great triumphs of this new and somewhat dubious for many people science, and there are even a lot of doctors who don't believe that, you know, every week they're finding new bacteria with strange Latin names and who knows what they're going to find next week. But one of the first great triumphs of bacteriology is figuring out, first of all, identifying the bacteria that causes diphtheria. Second of all, figuring out it's not just this bacteria, but it makes a poison. There's a toxin that the bacteria makes, and that's what does the damage. That's what attacks your heart. That's what causes all of this terrible respiratory disease. And then creating an antitoxin, an antidote. And it's the first great medical triumph of this new science of bacteriology. And it's the famous story because it's the antitoxin that the heroic sled dogs carry across Alaska when there's a diphtheria epidemic among the children in Nome in the 1920s, and the harbor is frozen and they can't get it there. And when they run the race every year, the Iditarod, they're running along that trail that the sled dogs carry the antitoxin to save the children.
You know, Perri, you tell a lot of extraordinarily wonderful, dramatic, and sometimes very painful stories in this book. One of the most painful actually concerns a great pioneering pediatrician, and that is Dr. Jacoby and his wife, Mary Putnam Jacoby, also a physician, and how they lost their child to diphtheria. And Jacoby was one of those who was skeptical about bacteriology. That's why there's a kind of irony in that.
Mm.
But you talk about, as a pediatrician, for example, expecting your patients to remain alive. But here was a pediatrician and his wife who lost, how many children was it, Perri? 5?
Well, he lost a number of children in infancy. He lost at least 3 who were born and kind of didn't make it out of the delivery room. And this is happening in the late 19th century. And one of the reasons it's strange is that he does the diagnosing. He fills in the death certificate for his own children. And this is Abraham Jacoby. We think of him as the father, the founding father of American pediatrics. He's a brilliant German doctor. He studies in Germany. He comes to the United States. He's revolutionary minded. He's one of the reasons my field, pediatrics, from the very beginning has paid attention to social factors, paid attention to poverty, paid attention to hygiene, not been about, you know, just disease or individual action, but really seen that children, in order to be healthy, need supports from, you know, their community, from their country, from people around them. But anyway, so he's founding father of American pediatrics, Abraham Jacoby. Even when I'm training 100 years later, we're quoting him famously. He's the one who is always quoted as saying, children are not small adults. You should probably imagine that in a heavy German accent. but that children are not just small adults, that you have to understand children scientifically. Anyway, he writes voluminously about everything, Abraham Jacoby. He marries another doctor, brilliant doctor, Mary Putnam Jacoby, studies medicine in the United States, one of the early women doctors, then goes off to Paris because she wants to study medicine at the Sorbonne. She's the first woman allowed to study medicine in Paris at the Sorbonne. They make her use a separate entrance so she, won't come too close to the male students, does brilliantly, comes back to the United States, very interested in women's health, women's diseases. The two of them marry. So in that room, you've got more expertise on children and childhood diseases, on women's diseases, and generally such, for their time, modern medical expertise. So they lose their first baby who dies at birth, but then they have a son and a daughter, and they're growing up. And in 1880, Abraham Jacoby publishes a treatise on diphtheria. He probably knows as much about clinical diphtheria and treating children as anybody in the world. And if you read that treatise on diphtheria as a pediatrician, it kind of breaks your heart, because he's writing about all the children he's seen, and he's describing all scientifically all of the manifestations. But what he's basically saying over and over is, and I couldn't save this child, and I couldn't save that child. He's doing tracheotomies, he's trying to do emergency airways, but it doesn't work. So anyway, in 1880, he publishes this authoritative treatise on diphtheria, and then a couple of years later, his own children come down with diphtheria, and his son Ernst, whom he loves dearly, dies, and there's nothing that either parent can do, because there's nothing anyone can do. And one of the reasons that I tell some of these stories of the children of presidents or the children of prominent doctors, is because they help express that idea that even if you had the best doctors, even if you were the richest man in history, even if you were John D. Rockefeller, even if you were the president of the United States, there was nothing anybody could do, to keep children safe. And that's a different world.
And today, just so that we're clear, so that everyone listening will know, how many children in the United States die of diphtheria?
Diphtheria is gone in this country. It's gone. We immunize against diphtheria, that heroic antitoxin that you could use as a medicine that the sled dogs carry across Alaska. We don't use it anymore because there's a good vaccine. We vaccinate children against diphtheria, and it's gone. And one of the things that I realized, therefore, is that it for some people, it stops being real. And I think about this in the book when I think about people who are more afraid of vaccines than they are of diseases. You lose touch with the diseases you haven't seen. And even the diseases that terrified me in the 1980s when I was training, the diseases which were, the monsters lurking over my shoulder in a children's hospital in the 1980s that are gone now. The doctors who train nowadays, very reasonably, they have the relationship to them that I might have had to diphtheria or polio. You learn them out of a book. You need to know about them. They need to be on your mind, but they don't keep you up at night any more than diphtheria does or should keep a parent awake at night worrying today. You don't worry as a parent today. He has a sore throat. Could it be diphtheria? We know what we're worried about today. There's a different worry that's sitting on parents' shoulders. But I think it's important to remember that up until the end of the 19th century, this was part of the package of being a parent, was thinking, could this be diphtheria? Could this be scarlet fever? And knowing that if it was, there was just a real limit on what anyone could do.
Or even the kind of infant diarrhea, which was extremely common and for which infants died en masse, and still do actually in different parts of the world because of bad water sources. So the interventions of cities and reformers who were able to clean up milk and water made a huge difference as well.
Well, absolutely. And just as I was saying a little earlier that, children are vulnerable to respiratory diseases because they have these small airways, children are vulnerable to dehydration. It has to do with having a lot of surface area relative to their volume. If you blow up a beach ball, you sort of, and when you're smaller, you have much more surface area related to your volume. And what that means basically for children is that they lose heat and they lose water across their skin at a fairly rapid rate, and they don't have nearly as much blood in them, obviously, as adults do because they're smaller. They're vulnerable to dehydration. And if you've got a kid, you've probably heard this from a doctor. If your child had a stomach upset, the stomach upset's not going to hurt your child, but you have to keep the child hydrated. You have to keep putting in fluid or offering various kinds of, liquids with salt and sugar in them. Anyway, so back again in my grandmother's era, back when my parents were being born in the 1920s in New York City, in the cities, the civilized, the places that thought of themselves as centers of art and culture and civilization, children were dying, especially babies, in huge numbers of what was thought of as the summer diarrhea, the cholera infantum that came in the summer, the stomach illnesses, which we look at now and we say the milk was going bad, people didn't have refrigeration, especially people, the water wasn't clean. And it was just one bug after another. But what was killing the children, what was killing the babies, was the dehydration that came with that stomach upset. They called it cholera infantum. And it turned out that the way to get at it, there's not a magic bullet here, in the sense that there's not a medicine, there's not a single vaccine, though we vaccinate now against rotavirus, which is one of the viruses which can cause that diarrhea. But what you actually did, what actually turned it around, was parents, educating parents, learning about using the safe milk, breastfeeding, opening up milk stations where pasteurized clean milk could be sold to people for not too much money. There was a philanthropist in New York, Nathan Strauss, who was one of the owners of Macy's. That was his cause, milk stations around the city where you could sell pure milk. And then later on, they became clinics where babies could be examined and parents could learn about hygiene and how to keep babies safe, but also it involved making the milk available, making the water supply safe, parents taking control and keeping their children safe. And that's before you have antibiotics, that's before you have most vaccines, right? That's infrastructure, that's public health. But it's a tremendous difference in terms of believing. Josephine Baker, who's one of the doctors I write about, who was the first chief of the New York Bureau of Child Hygiene, which was the first such child health bureau in the country, what she wrote was what they learned when the public health nurses, who were probably the real heroines of the story, when the public health nurses started going out into people's homes and working with parents, making sure they had clean milk, clean water. What she wrote was what they had learned was that heat did not necessarily kill babies. You could get babies through the summer, even in the city, even in the crowded tenements. Babies could come through the summer and be safe.
Well, one of the transformations of that period too was the instruction of mothers, so that it wasn't just giving healthy milk to children, but teaching mothers various kinds of basics, so that the Children's Bureau released baby and child care pamphlets, which was spread all across the country through the House of Representatives. I mean, congressmen literally took these and sent them out to people in rural areas as well as urban areas. About half of all Americans received these pamphlets, where they learned basic things about nutrition, basic things about childcare, and that emphasis on childcare became a very essential part of the role of pediatricians in the larger society, which also had some negative consequences, which is, and that is that the child care experts became not only advisors, but made families, made mothers especially, increasingly anxious to be able to do the right thing by their child. I mean, there was an increasing emphasis on the mother's role in keeping the child alive, the mother's role in making sure that the child's welfare was taken care of. So that increased the sense of responsibility. I mean, you begin gradually to lose that sense that, well, everybody loses a child, or this is a very common occurrence. If I lose a child, then it's my fault. And I think that's part of where we are today.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's tremendously complicated. I mean, I don't want to sound in any way like people took for granted the loss of a child. It was tragic. When you read those letters that women wrote to the Children's Bureau about having lost children, you identify with them completely. You hear their pain. You know that it will relieve them. But there was, without question, a certain sense of inevitability for many of them. And so once you start saying, no, it's not, it doesn't have to happen. And that was absolutely part of the message of the Children's Bureau and of those pamphlets, and also of the pediatricians. No, you can, you have the power to keep your children safe. You have the power if you do this, if you do that. Now, of course, the truth is that sometimes you don't, and that's still true today. And if you make it sound like, oh, if only you do everything right, there's a guarantee, then you're putting people in a very difficult position. On the other hand, you also want parents to have a sense of their own power, their own strength, their own importance. And I think that question, you've written about this whole question of anxiety. One of the things I was interested in writing this book was the issue of parents who are living with so much more safety than my grandmother could ever have imagined. Are they less anxious than my grandmother or more anxious than my grandmother? And most people seem to think that they're probably, on the whole, more anxious, right? Yeah. Even though they are living with all kinds of safety, which my grandmother would not even have been able to dream of. So somehow into that mix, and I think what you're saying is absolutely right. Once parents get the sense that that kind of safety is possible, and my grandmother would probably have said, even if you're John D. Rockefeller, who was the richest man in history, who was the first billionaire, and who founded the Rockefeller Institute when his beloved grandson died of scarlet fever, a disease which would now be easily treatable with antibiotics. My grandmother would have probably looked you in the eye and said, even if you're John D. Rockefeller himself. So there's a kind of safety here that she could never have imagined, but there's also a kind of parental responsibility that you've got to make the right decisions and that you've got to, right? And as you were saying, the experts, including the pediatricians, probably bear a considerable piece of responsibility for how parents feel that anxiety. Don't you think?
I do. I mean, I was thinking about why it is that so few Americans today, I won't speak of others, it's true elsewhere as well, have any sense of how fortunate and privileged they are because their children will survive them in 99% of the cases. And I know that as a historian, I can blame myself. There hasn't been enough written about the history of parenting, which is why I set out to write my book about the history of parenting, to inform parents so that parents don't know that they have a history, that there is a change over time. But then I was also thinking that there is a responsibility, and you've taken it on, for pediatricians and doctors to let their clientele, their families, their mothers know how fortunate they are. After all, they are treating well babies. I mean, most pediatricians, as you so effectively write in your book, are really dealing with the normal child, the healthy child, and doing checkups. And maybe maybe not only should historians be more aware and tell the audience that we are living in a fortunate time, the pediatricians need to do that too.
I think you're right. And I think we tend as pediatricians, we are, I have to tell you as a group, we are extraordinarily grateful for vaccines. It's one of the reasons why we are, why we talk as much as we do about them, why we love them as we do, vaccines as we do, because we do have a sense of how much they matter. But it may also be one of the reasons why we haven't always been able to respond as well as maybe we should when people worry about vaccines, because we have a sort of a disbelieving, what, vaccines? They're a gift, they're so amazing, they're wonderful. Because we have these vaccines, maybe we've got still a little bit of a sense of what it used to be like to be taking care of children and to have to see all of those cases of, when I was training people, the people who were my teachers would sort of talk about polio and, which they had seen, which was around when my parents were growing up. Every summer, polio, the epidemic came through. And they, so that our teachers maybe would talk about that, or they would talk about measles. And we would kind of look at each other and roll our eyes a little bit, because who's going to see a case of polio in the 1980s in Boston? It's, like diphtheria. And I think that, when people who are my age talk about the diseases we were terrified of in our residencies in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, the bacterial meningitis that we now immunize against, which, I
experienced as a parent. Yes, we had a conversation about this. I experienced it as a parent, and today meningitis is no longer on people's radar screen.
It happens, it's very rare, but every single night that I was a resident in pediatrics, we worried that one of the small children in the emergency room with a fever might have had bacterial meningitis from one of the bad bacteria. They were rare, they weren't the ones that parents thought about, but I you that every pediatrician and every pediatric resident thought about them every day, and we now immunize against them. Again, they're rare. Many people probably aren't even aware that the children are being protected, but they're protected, and they're bad diseases that terrified us in the 1980s that are gone. But if I start telling that story nowadays to residents in training, and they probably have that same look on their face of, could we talk about something that we're actually likely to see?
They need to read your book.
Oh, of course.
Your residents absolutely need to read your book. I think one of the things that might be interesting to the audience too is you talk a lot about presidents who lost their children, beginning back in the 19th century. But one of the presidents who lost his child was not that far back. Some of the miraculous transformations that have taken place are actually more recent. John F. Kennedy lost a child in 1961 when he was, or was it 1960 when he found
63.
out?
No, 63. It's the only child born to a sitting president in the 20th century. And this was actually a child that we talked about during my residency, because it was only 20 years before my residency. And to be honest, the first night of my residency, I was in the newborn intensive care unit, feeling completely overwhelmed. And, there were these impossibly tiny premature babies and these amazing machines. And I was, a month out of medical school and completely terrified to be in this world. One of the things that they talked about was how a little more than 20 years earlier, in the early 1960s, the President of the United States and the First Lady had a son who was born premature, but by our standards, not that premature. A little boy, right, who was born 4 or 5 weeks too early while the First Lady was vacationing on Cape Cod, born at the Air Force Base, taken by ambulance to our hospital, Children's Hospital in Boston. And the reason I tell these stories is because definition that everything that can be done is being done, right? With these presidential children that everything is available, everything's being done. But in 1963, there is no way to help a premature baby breathe, even a baby who is not that small, not that premature. The technology doesn't exist in the early 1960s. And by the middle of the 1980s, 20 years later, when I'm training, we are routinely, without even thinking that it's a miracle, not just saving babies who are 4 or 5 weeks premature, but saving babies, normal full-term gestation is 40 weeks. So are we saving 36 weekers? They're 4 weeks early. We almost don't think of them as very premature. We're 35, 34, 33, 32, down. And that has become, it's a little bit of a miracle, but it's become a routine medical miracle. And that's happened very recently. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that in some ways, the last stages or the second half of the 20th century, some of the progress that's happening with infant and child mortality is actually happening in that first month of life. With premature infants, with infants who are born with various medical problems, that early mortality is still a big issue, even up to the Second World War and into the second half of the century.
For sure, yeah. Yes, it is. So I always imagine that there are two big transformations that take place. One is right after the Second World War, and that's in part because of antibiotics. And the fact that we have a huge baby boom taking place. I mean, it's a really whole new world that happens. There's the expectation of prosperity. There's Dr. Spock, who's guiding who's guiding almost everybody in this genial and hopeful way, optimistic way. And then there's another transformation that takes place, and that transformation takes place around the mid-1970s and 80s. And that's the period, I think, of accelerating anxiety, which we touched on earlier, where parents become more anxious. And, I've written about the history of child kidnapping, and that, of course, was a period of real crisis where there was the imagined and real understanding that kidnapping by strangers was an epidemic. That's the best way to describe it, actually, which in fact wasn't the case. So something has happened over the course of those years, and might help some of the people who are involved in our conversation right now to think about why, in the midst of all these miracles, why in the midst of the ability for us and for pediatricians to save so many babies, including very tiny infants, we have become such an anxiety-ridden set of parents who are constantly terrified that something is going to happen to their children. Perri, what do you think?
I would guess, and you tell me, that some level of anxiety has always gone with being a parent.
Yes,
and
I completely agree with that.
I mean, you give your heart away as a parent, and person who is most precious to you is out there taking her first steps as a toddler and then living out in the world, going to school. So some of it has always been there. I think that, as I say, I think that once we get the idea in our heads that if we just make the right decision at every point, the last chapter of my book is called The Promise of Safety, and looks at the question of whether somehow parents get the sense that absolute safety is promised if only you make every decision right. And of course, there's absolute safety, and nobody can ever promise you anything. And one of the things that I also talk about, because it came up many times while I was writing the book, is people nowadays who lose children. One of the things that many of them talk about, that many of them say, is that they're very isolated. that nowadays, if you are, I don't know, if you're in a group, if you're introducing yourself, if people ask you if you have children, you can't casually, easily, or even not casually reference having a child who's no longer alive. It stops the conversation. It terrifies people. It's the only thing they can talk about. And paradoxically, that has the effect of leaving you alone, leaving you isolated, as if this sad thing that's happened to you is such a terrible thing that it can't even be discussed. And there have been ways in which, in a world in which it was unfortunately a much more common tragedy, there may have been ways that you could remember it, talk about it, even keep that child with you, that people found comforting. But I don't know if that answers your question about the anxiety. And
I actually think that's a very good point. I mean, one of the things, of course, that they did in the 19th century is they took images of dead children and they wrote poetry about dead children.
Yes.
And so there was a whole culture that within which your own grief could be embedded, and different rituals that would allow you to express it. So what you're describing here is a culture now where there are no rituals, there isn't even the language within which one can discuss the death of a child, because it has become so uncommon. So I can understand that being a very difficult thing to bear. I mean, we have, as a culture in general, we have a problem discussing death, but the death of children, that is the ultimate taboo, I really think, both in terms of our own fears and in terms of the ability to discuss it. But I do think there's another dimension to it that we maybe haven't discussed, and that is the pressures that have been put on women since the 1970s, since the liberation of women in a lot of ways. You know, they're wonderful, absolute. We wouldn't be here discussing this if it weren't for that. So I want to be very clear about that. But the pressures on women, especially women who have children, who certainly in that earlier period and even now were concerned about childcare, were concerned about doing it right in all directions, not having the social and community supports of knowing there was a neighbor at home, because the neighbor is also working. I mean, everyone is out of the home working. And so the concerns about how to adequately care for children emerged, I think, in part in terms of the enormous sense of inadequacy, I think, that a lot of mothers felt. They couldn't do it all. They couldn't do it perfectly. And if they didn't do it perfectly, they might lose their child. So, and there's also the dimension, as we've talked before, about technology itself, which has put additional strains on mothers who now discuss these. Now they're not isolated. They discuss these things with each other all the time on the internet and on blogs. They also hold each other up to very high standards.
Yeah. I think that's true. I'm not sure what it is about being a parent which calls forth as much judgmentalism as it does. One of the things that I've learned, and I write about parents and children, is that the world is really full of people who want to judge parents, want to judge parents, I don't know, across the room, across the restaurant, across the park. And people don't walk around, I mean, I'll just say this in terms of my experience in writing about children. People don't look at you as, when you're there out there as a parent. Let's say you're out there as a parent having a somewhat difficult time with an obstreperous toddler, which has happened to all of us. It happens to all of us. People don't look at you and think, boy, that's probably that mother or that father's worst moment of the week. Having a hard time. People look at you and they judge. And if you write about it, they write in and they judge. And they judge in all directions. I know, and I've written about this, that the world is full of parents the world's full of people who want to write in and say, either parents today, They're all looking at their cell phones all the time. They're not paying attention to their children. Their children are badly behaved and rude. These parents, put down your cell phones and be a parent. And a similar group of people who want to write in and say, parents today, helicopter, hovering,
Yes,
pay,
right.
you know, and you sort of want to say, wait, which is it? Are the parents not paying enough attention? Are they paying too much attention? And the column that I ended up writing about this was basically called "Everything You Do Is Wrong." Okay?
Yes, well, that I think is precisely what parents do feel. Everything they do is wrong. In one of the most extreme cases, Eitan Potts's mother, Eitan Potts was kidnapped in New York City. She was accosted on the street by parents who said, "Oh, well, you're the woman who lost her child." Not that she was this victim of this terrible, terrible kidnapping crime, but that she had lost her child, that she was somehow responsible. So this kind of judgment can even take on that macabre quality.
Well, one of the things that I write about in the 20th century, just to sort of put a positive spin on this, is that I write about the fact that in the 19th century, frequently parents who were bereaved, especially very wealthy parents who found themselves, say, with a great fortune and no heirs, they founded hospitals, they founded clinics, they founded Stanford University or Wellesley College. These are institutions which were built by, affluent parents who lose their children and do something else with their estate, do something else with their fortune. In the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century, parents who lose children frequently turn into advocates. No other child should die by by this. So I am going to advocate for car seat laws or booster seat laws for older children because it turns out that it's still not safe for a child to be in a car. I'm going to advocate for drowning prevention. And that kind of activism in which parents, on the one hand, they feel, and I've talked to some of these parents, I've interviewed people who are anti-drowning activists who are telling and retelling the story of the most terrible day of their lives. Because they're, and when they tell that story, there's this narrative of, I will never forgive myself for. I looked away for 1 second. And so I want everyone else out there to know that. And they're doing this very noble work with that terrible story. But on the other hand, one of the things you have to realize as a parent is there are a lot of moments in being a parent. And if you, in fact, hold yourself to the highest possible standard, there is a great deal of anxiety. And one of the things I noticed in writing about parents from the 19th century and the early 20th century is it's always true, or not always, but it's often true that parents who lose a child have some what if, even if it's if only we hadn't moved to the city where something happened.
Perri, before we turn to questions, I want to just pursue that for a minute. Is that also true for parents who lose young infants, or is it only true for parents who've had some experience with a child? I'm curious.
I think the truth about young infants is that for a very long time, probably up till close to the time of, say, my birth, up to the post-war period, the overwhelming sense is that there's not anything that anyone can do about most of the very young children who died. Doctors believe that, experts believe that and if you look at, say, some of the pioneering texts on infant mortality, what they will say is, well, there's really nothing you can do about the children who die in the delivery room, but the children who make it out and then get diarrhea when they're 6 months old, if we pasteurize the milk and build and educate, we can save those children.
Right. Well, I want to tell everyone who's joined us that Perri had some wonderful slides, which we have now not had enough time to show, but you should look for them in her book. There are some remarkably, really beautiful pictures of parents who lost children, and of visiting nurses, and of doctors. They're remarkable images, which I'm now sorry we didn't have a chance to show, but people who buy the book will have a chance to see them. So I do think we have some questions. Are you ready to entertain questions?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, then I will go and see what I can get. So I've got 3 questions. I'll start with the last question. Have you found, this question is from, oh, now I've lost it. This question is from Harvey. Have you found any strategies for educating anti-vaxxers?
So this is an issue which comes up a great deal in pediatrics, and I think that we're learning as much as we can to try not to divide people into categories that are too rigid, to recognize that a lot of parents feel some kinds of hesitancy and uncertainty about vaccines, and that this is a conversation which kind of needs to start as early as possible and needs to go on as a conversation. Pediatricians as a group are, we hope, learning more and more about how to explain vaccines and the importance of vaccines. But I think we're seeing in this moment when we're living through the pandemic that the questions of how you understand and explain different kinds of safety and different kinds of risk are complicated conversations, and that what pediatricians, I think, for a long time longed for was that Dr. Spock moment that Paula was talking about, in which, you know, I could sort of say to you, I'm the expert, this is what you should do, which would have worked very well with my grandmother, but it's not what parents nowadays expect or deserve. So it's not one strategy, it's conversation, it's information, and it's also trying to figure out. So I'm just going to sort of say, for pediatricians in general, it doesn't come easily to tell terrible stories and say, this is what it looks like to die of diphtheria, don't let that happen to your baby. It's not how you like to conduct yourself as a pediatrician holding somebody's baby. So you have to find a way to talk about risk, you have to find a way to talk about safety, you have to find a way to talk about science that respects the intelligence of the people that you're talking to. But we've also all learned, and we're learning over and over again, that there is so much information out there that people have access to, and some of it is wrong. Some of it is
wrong.
Not the information.
And it's also related to the fears that parents have of being implicated in something that will then make the child sick, or really bring some kind of hazard to the child. So the anti-vaxxers are also concerned with their own potential involvement, and they want to be perfect. They want to do the best they can for their child. So having that kind of attitude, I think, is well, it's essential. I mean, it's part of this larger picture that we've been talking about. So here's another question for you. And this question is by, it's by Brooke. Are any regions or societies with surprisingly high or low child mortality? Are there any regions or societies with surprisingly high or low mortality rates? Has there ever been a group of people that defy the expectations for child mortality for that time period? That's really 2 questions. I'm sorry.
Sure. So I think one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at the recent global figures, and the Gates Foundation has a report, and there was actually a piece in the New York Times not long ago about the fact that fewer children are dying everywhere. The global mortality figures for child death are actually better all over many parts of Asia, better all over many parts of Africa. The figures are better, but it's very regional. So if you actually drill down and you look at sort of one region of India versus another, and you look at where local governments have invested in maternal child health and sanitation systems and education, you can see as it's not just this is the country, this is its income level. It's actually local infrastructure, local investment, local education. And it's actually really interesting because it goes back to, say, the pioneering work on, it's called Infant Mortality, a Social Problem, which was published in 1906 in England. And again, even in that book, on the one hand, he was making the argument that it is a social problem. It's a problem of poverty. It's a problem of sanitation. It's a problem of making women go back to work in factories right after they give birth so they can breastfeed. But even given all of that, he was able to show really marked regional variation. So up until the middle of the 20th century, and even still in most parts of the world where there's not a safe water supply, breastfeeding is life and death. So if you have a society where for one reason or another, even though people may be poor, even though people may be working hard, even though there may be all kinds of other risk factors, if the society is set up so that mothers can all breastfeed their children, they're going to do better than what may be an on paper more affluent society where for one reason or another, babies are not getting breastfed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that certainly addresses most of them, but is that regional difference also true in the United States? Is there still a rural-urban difference in the United States as there used to be?
There are very strong regional differences. Well, overall in the United States, we're talking about a much lower infant mortality rate and a much lower maternal mortality rate. But we also know there are major regional differences from state to state and even within states. And there are also major disparities by racial and ethnic group. Infant mortality and maternal mortality in the United States are much higher among African Americans, among indigenous peoples, and those disparities are not just reflecting geographical distribution disparities, they're also reflecting issues in terms of medical care, issues in terms of systemic racism. They've been persistent, and they have persisted even while the mortality rate overall among all groups was coming down dramatically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, and I think we have time for one more question. This is a question from, and it's a good question to end on. It's also by Brooke. Are there lessons from your research that would be applicable to parents trying to keep their kids safe from COVID? So it brings us literally into this moment.
So I think this is a moment when we're all learning again, as we unfortunately do periodically, about what it is to live with the microbes, the viruses and the bacteria that are around us, that for all of our science and for all of our expertise still surprise us and still threaten us. I think that for parents who are trying to keep their children safe, the messages that apply, first of all, public health is really important. You don't think about, I must make singly all of the absolute right decisions. You think about, what do we do in our community to keep each other safe? And how do I explain it to my children, not just as we are keeping you safe, but we are all keeping each other safe. We are doing certain things, we are changing our lives in certain ways because we can protect each other. And I think that being able to talk to your children that way and narrate it and help them understand that they are in part also the agents of safety and the heroes, and that they have a part to play, helps everybody understand the narrative of the times that we're living through. I think, but again, I would start with the idea that the public health interventions come before the scientific miracles, but that the public health interventions that keep families and communities safe are tremendously useful and can take you a long way.
That's great. That's certainly the case as we wait for a vaccine, that it has to be both of those things, the public health, our own responsibility, as well as a kind of miraculous scientific medical change. Well, this is.
I hope it's a moment. Sorry. I was going to say.
No, Perri.
No. I'm gonna make the inevitable pediatric comment that I hope it's a moment when, as we wait and hope and expect that vaccine that will, give us back our world, give us back our lives, we stop and appreciate what vaccines already do for us and for our children.
Yes, it's a great pediatrics comment. This has been a wonderful evening. Thank you so much, Perri. It's been, and thank you to the audience and for the excellent questions. It's really been an enjoyable time. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula.
This is Bruno from Town Hall. Leela has a little issue with her microphone right now. She will be right back with the conclusion.
So would you like us to make a conclusion?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay.
Perri, you.
I hold up my book. I've been talking, Perri Klass, we've been talking about my book, A Good Time to Be Born, about the way that the world changes and parenting changes and everything changes when we can start expecting our children to live to grow up. Leela, if you were here and you want to talk, you should just make a noise so we know you're here.
Hey, I'm here. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Yes, thank you both for speaking tonight. It was a wonderful event. And thank you to the audience for being here. If you enjoyed this event, you can find many more like it on our website, townhallseattle.org. And we hope that you'll consider making a donation, as your support will allow us to continue to provide events just like this one. If you're interested in purchasing Perri's book, A Good Time to Be Born, How Science and Public Health Gave Children the Future, please use the link on this website to purchase through our friends at Third Place Book. Finally, thank you again for being here, and we hope everyone has a great evening.